Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SF Commons Special Elections Report. We're coming to you live. Tonight, we're covering some very important statewide measures. There are altogether, if you look at your voter's handbook, there are 17 statewide measures. In San Francisco, we have 25 measures. So tonight, we pick 3 of the statewide measures. And we're very fortunate that we have 3 people from the Legislative Analyst Office of the state of California to explain 3 important measures. We have Proposition 51, which is going to be presented by Mr. Dan Kaplan. He's a fiscal and policy analyst with the Analyst Office. Dan graduated with a master's in public policy from the University of Michigan, and he's got his BA in economics from UC Berkeley. Proposition 51 authorizes $9 billion in general obligation bonds for construction of new public schools, meaning elementary schools, community colleges, special education schools. Next, we have Ben Johnson, a fiscal analyst. He graduated with a master's in public policy from the University of Michigan also, and he has his BA in law and politics from Drake's University. Ben is going to make a presentation regarding Proposition 61, which prohibits the state from buying prescription drugs at less cost than what it acquires for the U.S. Veterans Affairs. And lastly, we have Ashley Ames. She is a fiscal and policy analyst with a master's in public policy in public affairs from the Indiana University and a BA in history and economics from Indiana University. Ashley will be talking about both Proposition 65 and 67 regarding the carry bags, the plastic bags, which I'm sure all of you will have fun hearing about tonight. So with that, if you have any questions or would you like to call in and ask this analyst any questions about the specific measures that they're covering, you may call 415-861-6648. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hello, Dan. So we have Dan Kaplan to talk about Proposition 51.
Thank you. Before I start talking about Proposition 51, let me just speak to a little bit more about my office and the role we play in the initiative process or the ballot process. We serve as the nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisors to the state legislature. So we don't work for either the Assembly or the Senate. We work for both houses, and we advise them on a range of issues. But we're here today to speak to the ballot process. Our role there primarily occurs in 2 stages. First, when any citizen of California submits an initiative along with a check to the Attorney General's office, we will conduct an initial analysis where we'll provide a summary of the fiscal effects, and that will go out to voters as canvassers go across the state trying to solicit signatures for the measure. And once it officially qualifies for the ballot, which as you indicated earlier, there are 17 different measures on the ballot in November, we will do a more in-depth analysis and publish that as part of the voter guide. Now, this is a nonpartisan analysis such that we don't interject our own opinions. We just try to speak to what the programs that exist today and how the measures may change them. Moving on to Proposition 51, the school bond. It allows the state to sell $9 billion in state general obligation bonds to fund school facilities. $2 billion of this would go to fund community colleges, while the remaining $7 billion would go towards K-12 districts. Now, of this $7 billion, $3 billion would go towards new construction projects. This is the purchase of land, the design of buildings, and the construction of new buildings. $3 billion would go towards the renovation of existing school facilities, and the remaining billion would be split evenly between career technical education facilities and charter schools. Provide a bit of context as far as how the program operates today. On the K-12 side, districts will first submit project proposals to what's known as the Office of Public School Construction. And the Office of Public School Construction will vet these proposals and determine whether or not they meet certain state criteria. Now, the state only contributes a portion in most cases.
Oops, sorry. Hello?
Hi, this is
Channel
Rick Marshall.
76? Oh, hey, Mr. Marshall. So Dan Kaplan is now making a presentation about Proposition 51. So do you want to hold off on your question so that he can finish?
Yes, my problem is I can't see it on the web.
Oh, okay. It's okay. We'll tell you. All right. So if you can just hang on, you could, you could probably hear him.
I see it now.
Okay, I'm glad. All right, Mr. Kaplan.
Okay. So as I was saying, for nearly 2 decades, the state has had a cost-sharing arrangement such that both the state and local districts contribute towards the cost of construction projects. For new construction projects, which I discussed earlier, the state contributes 50% of the project costs. For the renovation side of projects, the state generally pays 60% of project costs. Now, the state can provide more funding if districts can demonstrate that they have had challenges in raising their local share. On the community college side, it's the chancellor of the community college system that vets various projects and determines which ones to bring forth to the state legislature. Now, the legislature then works with the governor through the annual budget process to determine which projects to fund. If Proposition 51 were to pass, it would fund the existing school facility programs and the processes for distributing these monies, as I had previously mentioned. In terms of the cost of Prop 51, our office estimates that it would cost roughly $17.6 billion to fully repay both the principal and the interest on these bonds. Now, $9 billion of this would be the initial principal that the state would receive, and the remaining $8.6 billion would be in interest payments. What this would mean on an annual basis is our office estimates that annual debt service payments from the state's general fund, and this is the fund that the state can use for really any purpose, these annual debt service payments would increase by $500 million per year for the next 35 years.
Okay, great. So, so you have a question?
Yes. My question is developer fees. How are they affected by Prop 51?
So as I mentioned earlier, Proposition 51 largely maintains the state's existing school facility program. I mentioned that there is both a state and a local component to funding many of these project costs. Now, the way local districts typically fund their share is through the issuance of local general obligation bonds, and you may see many of these in your local communities. Another less commonly used manner for funding the local share of these projects is through developer fees. The state, for a long period of time, was at what is known as a level 2 developer fees, and that's where developers could be charged up to 50% of the project costs for a new construction project, basically to cover up to the entire local share of the equation. Now, when the state is determined to be completely out of money, as was recently determined for these school facility projects, developer fees can be raised to cover the full cost of the project. With the existence of additional bond monies through Proposition 51, we would expect these developer fees to then lower back to the level 2, which implies that they could cover the local share.
So doesn't this shift the cost of new schools onto taxpayers instead of developers where they should be?
As I mentioned earlier, it would fund the existing program. So to date, developers, I believe, since over the past 2 decades, have contributed roughly $10 billion towards the construction of school facility projects. And if the bond funding were available, and developers could still be charged a component of these school facility costs.
What about the state debt? Are we like $85 billion in debt right now?
I don't have the numbers in front of me as far as how much in state debt we have. I can say that since 1998, the state has issued $36 billion in school facility bonds.
Okay, but I was talking about total state debt. Aren't we at a tipping point where they'll raise the interest rates on us for new bonds?
Much of the determinations as far as what goes into interest rates are made by credit agencies, and we have not performed an analysis of the impacts of those or the downstream effects of this measure.
Are you familiar with the audit that was done on the last school bond, Proposition 1D?
Which audit are you referring to?
I don't think it was the Legislative Analyst Office. I thought it was State Treasurer or something. I can't remember. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm familiar with an audit that I believe it was the Department of Finance conducted, and it was of the California State University system. A difference between Proposition 1D, which was the last bond to be passed back in 2006, and Proposition 51, is that Proposition 51 will not provide funding to the California State University.
All right, thank you so much for the call. It's a complicated, it's a fairly complicated measure, so I'm sure you'll have a lot more questions. And luckily, the Legislative Analyst Office are going through various communities and explain and talk directly to the voters to explain. Now, we still have two propositions which are also fairly complicated. So thank you so much for the call. And if you want to talk to Dan Kaplan, I'm sure you could get a hold of him through the Legislative Analyst Office. All right? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and then now we'll talk to Ben regarding the Proposition 61.
All right. Yeah, I will talk about Proposition 61, which is commonly known as the Drug Price Relief Act. The intent of Proposition 61 is to reduce state prescription drug spending, and it does so by setting an upper limit on what prices that the state may pay for the prescription drugs that it pays for that equals the lowest price paid by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, it applies to most state programs, such as Medi-Cal, which is the state's Medicaid program, which provides health coverage to low-income Californians. It also applies to the Department of Corrections, for example, and to CalPERS, which funds the health benefits of state retirees and current employees. In total, the amount of spending that occurs from this group of programs is about $3.8 billion annually. Now, the measure does exempt one specific program from the measure, and that is Medi-Cal, the low-income health program, the managed care side of that program. So Medi-Cal operates under two different service delivery systems: managed care, which serves approximately 75% of enrollees, and the fee-for-service system, which serves approximately 25% of those enrollees. Now, VA drug prices were chosen because as the upper limit for what the state may pay. Because VA prices are known to be amongst the lowest in the country. The VA receives certain statutory discounts on the drugs that they purchase, and they also use their collective buying power and certain other advantages that they have to negotiate prices below those statutory maximum prices that federal law grants them. So this measure it's intended to save the state money, but unfortunately we could not give a precise fiscal estimate for how much it would save. And there are a couple fundamental uncertainties that rendered us unable to provide a fiscal impact. The first is that some VA drug prices are actually not publicly available. Some are, but we don't know whether or not the state could actually obtain these currently confidential VA prices and then implement the initiative based on these the lowest VA prices or VA prices that are a little higher. And so that introduced one set of uncertainties. The second major uncertainty is how drug manufacturers might ultimately respond under the measure with regard to the provision and pricing of their drugs. How the measure works is it actually prohibits the state from paying more than VA prices for each of the drugs that the VA pays for. And so drug manufacturers could opt to actually not sell certain drugs to the state of California, and that could impact which drugs we provide, and it could ultimately mean that we would pay for drugs that are a higher price. Another plausible manufacturer response would be to actually raise the VA's prices. And then charge the state of California these higher VA prices. Previously, when there were some legal changes at the federal level that tied VA prices to what some other large programs could receive, this is what drug manufacturers did until a subsequent legal change actually exempted the VA's prices from this linkage and allowed VA prices again to be lower than what the other prices are. So the ultimate fiscal impact is uncertain.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ben. Now we talk to Ashley regarding the fun discussion on the carry bags and plastic bags, which I'm sure most of our folks are very confused about. Here you go, Ashley.
Excellent. Yes, as you know, there are two different measures that both relate to plastic bags and can potentially interact with each other, but I'll start by just describing Proposition 65 and what that might look like, and then move on to Proposition 67. So at a high level, what Proposition 65 does is it requires that revenue from the sale of any carryout bags at specific stores, when that sale is required by a state law that also bans other types of bags, go to a state fund for specific environmental purposes. But to understand the context of that, I think you need to know that there was a law that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in 2014. That is a carryout bag law for the state, and it's commonly referred to as SB 270. Now, SB 270 is not currently in effect because there is a referendum on it, which also appears on this ballot later down, and that's known as Proposition 67. But we'll get to that in just a moment. What 270 does, though, if it were to go into effect, is it bans certain stores from providing plastic bags to consumers, and it also requires that those stores charge 10 cents for paper and reusable bags. Under 270, that 10-cent charge is actually retained by the stores, can be used for specific purposes such as the cost of the bags themselves, compliance, and education on recycling. So if we assume that 270 is upheld and goes into effect, and that this measure, Proposition 65, also passes and goes into effect, what this would do is take that money and put it into a state fund that provides grants for specific environmental purposes. Finally, it is important to note that 65 only applies to the statewide law, and the statewide law only affects areas that don't currently have a local ordinance. So, for example, in San Francisco, that already had an ordinance in effect that applies to carryout bags, nothing would be changed, and that would be allowed to remain. And so the potential fiscal effect of diverting this money, we estimate, would be somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars should they both go into effect. Now, like I said, they'll interact with each other because they're appearing on the same ballot and they both have to do with the same subject matter. And so which one goes into effect actually depends on which gets more yes votes. And we have a figure that also appears in your voter guide to kind of explain what these different scenarios are. But essentially, if 270 is upheld and gets more yes votes, then because it says that the money goes to the stores, then that would be what happens. If both of them go into effect and 65 gets more yes votes, then the money would be diverted to the state. And if 65 doesn't pass, then it would not have an effect.
Question: is there a limit on the prices? Because I've seen, like, in San Francisco, I think they charge something like 10 cents a bag, and in Daly City it's like a quarter.
So
if these statewide measures pass, would it create a fixed price for the whole state, or is that still subject to the local ordinances?
Yeah, so the local ordinances that were already in place, pretty much by the end of 2014, will be allowed to remain. So if the local ordinance says 25 cents, then that will be what's in effect. Now, for the statewide law, if that's upheld and does go into effect, it just says that the minimum charge is 10 cents. So it does create a minimum, but the stores can charge more than that if that's what they decide to do. And so then, like I said, 67 is related to this, but that's the referendum on SB 270. And so in addition to the other things I mentioned that 270 would do, it also does some things like create standards for recyclable bags, such as durability and thickness. And so those would need to be tested by the state, and there are some minor fiscal effects that go along with that, but we estimate they would be probably less than $1 million. But once again, it would interact with 65, as we discussed in your voter guide. Now, ultimately, the courts will have to sort out how the two are going to interact together, but we think the most likely scenario would be the one that I described, in which 270 would go into effect, but if 65, the revenue initiative, got more votes, that money would be diverted to the state for environmental causes.
So anyway, as you can tell, these are very complicated issues. As a matter of fact, if you look at the contributions on some of these measures on the prescription drugs, over $100 million have already been spent opposing it. And on Proposition 51, over $11 million have already been spent trying to pass it. And then on the 65 and 67, over $6 million have already been spent each, either opposing it or supporting it. So ladies and gentlemen, we've presented you these three important measures, and we highly recommend that you look at this hefty book and dig through all of these measures, and feel free to call your local elections office. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you again next time. Good night.